Please welcome J.L. Collins.
Thank you.
Welcome. Welcome. So, my first question for you, the title of your book is The Simple Path to Wealth.
It is.
And it's a roadmap to financial independence and a rich, free life. So, what does wealth mean to you, and how is it tied to a free life?
Well, I suppose we could look at that in two different directions. So if we think about the psychological part of it, to me personally, what wealth represents is security and freedom. So security to protect you from what the world can throw at you, and freedom to chart your own path in a way that you couldn't do without the resource. On the financial point of view, I suppose when I think about what the benchmarks are for you wealthy or not, have you achieved financial independence or not, what has come to be called the 4% rule is a good guideline. That comes out of a thing called the Trinity study. And without belaboring that point, it simply suggests that if you have enough assets that 4% of that amount can cover your annual expenses, you can consider yourself financially independent. So you can work at it from two different directions. You could say, well, I have $1 million, so 4% of that is $40,000. Can I live on $40,000 a year or not? And therein lies the answer to your question. Or you can look at it from the other direction. You can say, I need $40,000 to live on, so how much do I need to be financially independent? You multiply 40,000 by, as it happens, 25. You get $1 million, and there's your answer. So it really depends on what your needs are.
Gotcha. And why is it important to keep the path simple? I think there are a lot of folks tuning in or folks in the audience who have read financial independence books and maybe their eyes roll back in their head because they just can't make sense of it all. So why is it important to keep it simple?
Well, that's one good reason. But the reason that I prefer keeping it simple is simply more powerful. Simple is what gets you the best results. And in this case, when I talk about simplicity, I'm talking about index funds and specifically broad-based stock and then bond index funds when you bring them into it. There are a lot of reasons that simplicity is an advantage. It keeps your costs low. It keeps your life simpler. It makes things, when the time comes, easier on your heirs. But the most important thing is it is the most powerful way to reach financial independence. People who come to my blog are always, I get two kinds of readers of my blog. People who are really into this stuff, and they always want to tinker. And that's not who I'm really writing for. I'm writing for people like my daughter who knows that it's important, but she has other things that she'd rather do with her life than fixate on finances and investing. And so when you have a simple path, you can just get a couple of things right. You'll have a very powerful performance. You will outperform the vast majority of professionals out there. And I'm fond of saying to those people who want to tinker, if I thought there was a way to successfully tinker and do better, then that's what I would have written the book about. And in fact, I wasted a couple of decades trying to find that.
Gotcha. So you have a blog, jlcollinsnh.com. If folks are interested in your content, should they begin with your blog or your book?
Well, I would suggest that if you don't know anything about me or this concept, I would go first to the blog. And I would go to, there's a button at the top called Stock Series, and the blog is best known for my stock series of posts. And when you click on that button, it will take you to an introduction, and in that introduction is a link to what I think is the best review of my stock series that's been done. And not best because it's most favorable, but in my view, most accurate. So you can click over to that and read that brief review, and after reading it, you'll know very clearly whether this is going to resonate with you or not, and whether it's worth your time. So I'd start there, and then I would read a couple of the posts. And then if you like what you read, you can consider going on to the book. There is nothing in the book that's not in the blog, so you can get all the information just by staying on the blog. The book is more concise. It's better organized because the posts in the blog came organically as they occurred to me or were suggested. And the book has the advantage of being better organized. It's more concise. And I spent more time polishing the writing, so I hope that the writing is more polished, but I'll let you'll make it the judge of that.
Got it. And thinking back to the early days of your own investment history, how did you learn all this stuff? How did you learn to invest?
Well, I did it the hard way. I mean, trial and error. I spent, as I alluded to earlier, decades trying to do things that were not. What's seductive about this is that they were subpar, but not bad performance. I tell people that long before I discovered or embraced index investing, I had reached financial independence. So I reached financial independence by picking stocks and picking mutual fund managers, active managers who could pick stocks or thought they could pick stocks. So it can be done. The problem with it is it's more expensive, it's more time consuming, it's not as effective as indexing. So I would have been much better off if I discovered indexing earlier. The great irony is that Jack Bogle, who was the founder of Vanguard and the inventor of the first index fund available to the public, launched that fund in 1975. 1975 was the first year I started investing. I'd never heard of Jack Bogle or Vanguard or index funds when I started. It was 10 years before I heard of them, and then it took me a disturbingly long time to embrace it. And so I went down, people say, how do you know all this stuff? And it's, well, because I made just about, if you can think of a mistake you can make in investing, I've probably made it. So to the extent that I know anything, it's from my mistakes.
So speaking of mistakes, what do you think was working in your favor versus working against you as you were trying to figure this out on your own?
Well, I think the main thing that was working against me at the time, and that is working against everybody listening to this, is there is a large industry, Wall Street, whose drumbeat is counter to our best interests, and that is based on making this as complex as possible, putting out a siren song that you too can be Warren Buffett, you too can pick stocks, you too can outperform the indexes. Only if you're willing to pay us for the privilege. And that's a very seductive message because everybody wants to think that they can be above average and outperform. But
you're in a room full of above average people.
Well, right. But maybe not in investing.
Okay.
Now, the irony is if you invest in index funds, and of course the slam that active managers put against index investing is that you will only get average returns. That's a little bit misleading because yes, the index gives you the return of the market overall, but that return is far above average. Index investing, based on the research that has been done, outperforms, depending on what numbers you look at, 80 to 85% of active managers over a 15-year period of time. If you research out 30 years, the number of active managers who can outperform the index is less than 1%. That's statistically zero. So when you invest in the index and you're getting the average performance of the market, you're actually getting the best performance that you can expect by a long shot.
Gotcha. And so what was working in your favor?
I think what was working in my favor is I continued being curious, and I continued trying different things, and I continued researching. And indexing, which was first put in front of me in 1985 by a good friend of mine, there's something about it that is very counterintuitive, and I think particularly for smart people like the people in this room and the people listening, because you look at it and you say, well, indexing says I buy every stock in the index. And yet, if I can only just not buy the obvious dogs, I'll outperform. I mean, outperforming seems like it should be so simple, but the problem with that, or even if I just buy the top performers, and not even by the mediocre or the low-performing ones, obviously I'm going to outperform. And yet you look at that research that says that doesn't happen. And of course, the reason it doesn't happen is today's dogs are sometimes tomorrow's great turnaround success stories. And those that are flying high are the stories of how they crash and burn. So there is no way to know what is going to happen with specific stocks, and it is just way too easy to guess wrong.
So one thing that struck me about your blog and your book is how specific the advice is. So in other books or websites I've tried reading in the past, the advice was always really vague, like invest in mutual funds. And it would leave me thinking, well, which one and how much? So why do you think other authors' advice is not very specific?
Well, I'm not sure I can answer that because I can't put myself in the heads of other people. Maybe I can answer it by telling you why my advice is what it is. And that's because I didn't write this blog to have the international audience that I have today. It never occurred to me that that would happen. I had started actually writing a series of letters to my daughter about financial things I wanted her to know. And I shared it with a business colleague of mine. He said, you know, Jim, this is kind of interesting stuff. You might want to share it with your friends and family, and a blog would be a good way to do that. And this is in 2011. I like the idea of a blog because it occurred to me that it would be a great way to archive the information. But I didn't have a plan to create a blog as a business or as a successful way to reach a broader audience. It was just to archive the information I wanted my daughter to know. And that was basically what mistakes I've made, what's worked, what's kicked me in the ass, and what I think specifically she should do. And so I think that's why my advice is so specific. These are the things that I'm doing now. These are the things I wish I had done in 1975, or at least in 1985 when I became aware of indexing. These are the things that I want her to do and that I've got her started doing. So that's maybe why my advice is more specific than others.
Okay. Yeah, I can't tell you how many times I've talked with a friend about how I'm on this new track where I'm investing, and they say, well, what are you doing? And I just send them one sentence of exactly what I'm doing, and that's what I read in your book. And they're like, that's it? And I'm like, that's it. That's all I'm doing. So aside from telling them to open their computer, start it up, and what clicks to make to log into their account, it's such simple advice.
You know, I was, a year and a half, 2 years ago, I was interviewed by Farnoosh Torabi on her podcast, and I don't know if anybody's listened to her podcast, but at the end of her interview, she likes to ask a question that says, if you were suddenly given $100 million, what would you do? And the typical kinds of answers she gets is, well, I'd buy this, that, I'd give this money away, I'd do that. And of course, she's interviewing me. We're talking about index fund investing, and specifically VTSAX, which is Vanguard's Total Stock Market Index Fund, and the one I recommend the most and love the best. And so when she got to that question, she said, well, Jim, you've got $100 million, what would you do? I'd put it in VTSAX. And she was, really, that's what you do? And